Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, the third for this week and the last for this week, we're going to talk about the metaphysical connection or the alleged metaphysical connection between religion and morality. So as we discussed last week, it's hard for moral realists to explain what objective moral rules are and to explain where they come from. They're very weird things. They're like rules built into the universe, if you're a moral realist, that aren't at all like physical laws. Laws of physics cannot be broken, but laws of morality can be broken, which is very different than other kinds of laws in like science and whatnot and math. And they're sort of values. Some things are good, some things are bad, objectively, independent of whether we think they're good or bad, whether or not they're good or bad for us personally, which is unlike everything else. Everything else that's objective, besides morality, is sort of neither good nor bad. It's neutral. The fact that the square root of 2 is irrational isn't like good or bad. It just is. There's no good amount of gravity or bad amount of gravity. It's just there's the force of gravity, which has a certain strength. There's no goodness or badness tied into math or physics or chemistry or anything else that's sort of objectively true. So morality, objectively true morals, are a weird thing to exist in the world. They're unlike everything else. And we might think that religion can explain what they are and where they come from. God or gods makes commands and forbids things, commands us to do things, forbids us from doing things. The things that are objectively good or bad are the things God takes to be good or bad. The things with positive moral worth, positive moral value, are the things that God values. So whatever is morally right is the stuff that God commands us to do. And what's morally wrong is whatever God forbids us from doing. Right? That's one way to explain what sort of objective moral truths are. They are God's commands and the things God forbids. That's what's morally right and morally wrong. And this view is called the divine command theory. It's an explanation of moral realism that says that the things that are morally good are whatever God commands, and the things that are morally bad are whatever God forbids. That's just what good and bad are. There's this sort of perfect pairing. God's commands and the morally right things are the same. The stuff God forbids and the stuff that's morally wrong are the same thing. So you get this sort of account of what's morally right and what's morally wrong, what the objective moral truths are in terms of what God commands and what God forbids. So this means something's right if and only if God commands it, and something's wrong if and only if God forbids it. But there is an argument against this, which comes from Plato in a dialogue Plato wrote in 2500 BC or something around there, called the Euthyphro, where Socrates is discussing religion and morality with someone named Euthyphro, and Socrates asks them if something's right because God commands it, or if God commands it because it's right. I mean, actually, it was ancient Greece. So what Socrates actually asks is whether pious actions are pious because all of the gods love those actions, or if all of the gods love those actions because they're pious. But the same basic argument applies here. The same basic structure to the argument holds. So the Euphyphro Dilemma is the question. If the divine command theory is true, then are things morally right because God commands them, or does God command them because they're morally right? So if the morally right actions are exactly the things God commands, then which causes which? Does God command things because they're morally right, or are things morally right because God commands them? Which comes first? That's the question. And it's a dilemma because it has two choices, and both turn out to be bad. So no matter which choice we take, whether we say things are morally right because God commands them, or if we say God commands things because they're morally right, it will turn out to be a problem for the divine command theory. So the Euthyphro argument is an argument based on the Euphyphro dilemma. It says, okay, the Euphyphro dilemma, there are these two options. Either, given the divine command theory, either things are morally right because God commands them, or God commands things because they're morally right. And either way, there's going to be a problem. So suppose that things are morally right because God commands them. Suppose option one is true. Well, then before God's command, they weren't morally right or morally wrong. Before God made commands, the things God commands us to do, maybe give to charity, don't murder, uh, treat others the way you want to be treated, etc. Before God commanded anything, nothing was morally right or morally wrong. If things are only morally right because God commanded them, then without commands from God, nothing's morally right. So prior to God's commanding and forbidding things, nothing's morally right or morally wrong. And that means God could have commanded and forbid anything. There was no right or wrong answer for what should be commanded or should be forbidden because nothing was morally wrong or morally right yet. Nothing's morally good or morally bad until God commands things. So that means God's commands were arbitrary. God could have commanded us to commit murder and to abandon our children and forbid us from donating to charity. And there would have been nothing wrong with that because nothing was right or wrong yet before God made commands. So that means God's commands are arbitrary. God could have commanded anything and had no reason for commanding one thing instead of another. God had no reason, had no basis for choosing one set of commands over another because none of them were morally right yet. So God could have forbidden kindness and commanded murder. Those weren't right or wrong before his commands. Kindness is good and murder is bad solely because God commanded it. But if God had commanded differently, he wouldn't have been wrong to do so because nothing was right or wrong yet. And so if things are morally right because God commands them, then God's commands are arbitrary. But this is a problem because God is usually taken to be perfect, morally perfect. But making arbitrary commands is imperfect. So let's look at the argument a little more carefully. If things are morally good because God commands them, then God's commands were arbitrary. But if God made arbitrary commands and then punishes people for disobeying those arbitrary commands, then God is morally imperfect. If you command someone to do something for no good reason and then punish them when they don't obey your arbitrary command, then you're not a morally perfect being. That is not a morally good thing to do. But by definition, usually, God is not morally imperfect. If God is the basis for morality, if such that things are right or wrong because God commanded them, then God can't be morally imperfect. the basis for all morality can't be morally flawed. That doesn't make any sense. So God can't be morally imperfect. Therefore, God must not have made arbitrary commands. Therefore, it can't be the case that things are morally good because God commands them. All right, so this part of the argument says that if we take option 1 of the dilemma and say that things are morally good because God commands them, then God's commands are arbitrary. And if his commands are arbitrary, then he's morally imperfect. But God can't be morally imperfect. So God can't have made arbitrary commands. Because if he had made arbitrary commands, then he would be morally imperfect. But if God didn't make arbitrary commands, then things can't just be morally good because God commanded them. Because if things were morally good only because God commanded them, then God's commands would be arbitrary, meaning he would be morally imperfect, which he isn't. So it cannot be the case that things are morally good because God commands them. Option 1 of the Euphyphro Dilemma fails. That is not true. That's not the correct option. So that only leaves option 2, that God commands things because they are morally good. On this option, God sees that something is morally good and therefore commands us to do that thing. On this option, God is commanding us to do things because God recognizes them as morally good. That is this picture. That is this image that we get from option 2 of the Euthyphro Dilemma. But this means that whatever God commands must have been morally good before God commanded it. Things are morally good or bad before God makes any commands at all. Because the only reason God commanded it in the first place was that it was already morally good. God commanded us to be kind to others or love thy neighbor or take care of your children or whatever God commands us to do because it's morally good to do that. So things are morally good or bad independent of God's commands. Because the only reason God commanded anything is that it was already morally good. And God recognized it and then commanded us to do what he already knew was morally good. But this means that moral rules do not depend on God for their existence. The moral rules were there before God made any commands at all. And they were there independent of God's commands. Because God's commands come after. God sees things are morally good and then commands them. So on this picture, God sees the moral rules because God is usually taken to be all-knowing, omniscient, and knows all the moral truths, and then commands us to follow those moral truths. But importantly, that means the rules were already there for God to recognize and then command us to follow. So on this option, option 2 of the Euphyphro Dilemma, God can still be morally perfect and all-knowing and all-powerful and yada yada, but God cannot be the metaphysical basis for morality. God can't be the source of moral rules, can't be the reason moral rules exist in the first place. On this option, the moral rules exist independently of God and God's commands. God recognizes moral truths that are already there and then makes commands based on those rules that were already there. So therefore, God and religion doesn't do any of the work to explain the metaphysical basis for moral rules. If you try to say that what's morally right is just whatever God commands, then the Euphyphro Dilemma forces you to end up saying that God made commands based on moral rules that were already there, which means those moral rules exist independent of God and religion. Even if you take there to be a God who commanded us to do all the right things and yada yada, you are committed to moral truths that are independent of God and God's commands. But if the moral truths are there independent of God and God's commands, then you could believe in them without believing in any God or gods. The moral rules have to be there sort of before God in some sense, independent of God and God's commands. And so, as long as they're independent, you can believe in one without the other. So you can believe in moral truths, objective moral truths, without believing in God or any commands from God. And so the Euphyphro Dilemma, if we look at the two options, gives us two outcomes. If we say things are morally right because God commanded them, then God is morally imperfect, morally flawed, and also the source of all morality, which is not an option. God, by definition, has to be morally perfect. The source of all morality can't be morally flawed. So option one fails. We should reject option one. And that only leaves us with option two, that God commands things because they're morally right. And on that option, morality does not depend on God. Moral rules are independent of God and God's commands. And so you can believe in them without believing in God. Right? So if God is the basis for moral truths, God can't be imperfect. And therefore, morality does not metaphysically depend on God. God is not where objective moral truths come from. So this metaphysical dependence connection that we might think is there must not actually be there. That account for the connection between morality and religion fails. The Euthyphro argument shows that if there are objective moral truths, they exist independent of any God or gods. And so you can believe in them without believing in any God or gods at all. All right, so that's the Euphyphro argument. That's the argument against this sort of metaphysical dependence. It's a bit of a complicated argument, so in addition to the lecture slides, I'll send out some lecture notes in the email this week. And if you have any questions about any of this, please let me know, and I will do my best to help in any way I can. Otherwise, I will see you in the videos next week.